My name is Selene Hart, 28 years old. The floorboard beneath my feet creaked like a death rattle as I pressed my trembling body against the hallway wall. My heart hammered so violently against my rib cage that I thought it might burst through my chest and scatter across the hardwood like shards of broken glass. From behind the bedroom door came voices muffled at first, then slicing through the silence I once thought belonged to my sanctuary. She has no idea, does she? The unfamiliar male voice was thick with amusement, every word laced with cruelty. Then came the sound that turned my blood to ice, my husband's laughter. The same laugh that had once made me weak in the knees now sounded like a serpent's hiss poised to strike. Selene, God, no. She's completely clueless. Carson's voice slithered through the crack. The woman actually thinks I love her. The world tilted. My knees threatened to collapse beneath me, but I clung to the doorframe like a lifeline. For a fleeting second, I prayed this was some nightmare, yet reality bit down harder with every word. The inheritance was worth every second of pretending to be straight. Carson continued the rustle of sheets, punctuating his confession. $23 million, James. $23 million for playing house with a lonely, desperate woman who'd believe any lie I fed her. Bile scorched the back of my throat. My marriage bed had become an execution chamber for every promise he'd ever made. "You're evil," Carson James whispered, though the tone carried more admiration than condemnation. 3 years of marriage to a woman just for money, I could never. It wasn't just the money, Carson said smoothly. I could hear him shifting skin against skin, a sound that made me nauseous. Her father's company comes with the package. Carson Industries will be mine the second the old man kicks the bucket. Celine's too soft, too trusting. She'll sign over power of attorney without a second thought. And when she does, everything her family built for 3 generations will be mine. The hallway spun around me. My father's company, my family's legacy. Carson's smirk even echoed in my mind as if mocking me from within. "What happens when she finds out?" James asked. Carson gave a laugh, unlike any I'd heard from him before. It was cold, stripped of every trace of humanity. "She won't live long enough to cause problems." The air left my lungs in a single, soundless gasp. My life split in two before and after. Before I was the doting wife, the trusting daughter, the hopeful heir. After I was prey, standing in the lion's den. Something inside me hardened. The Selene who believed in fairy tale love died in that hallway. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone forged in betrayal and tempered by rage. I should have stormed in. I should have screamed, clawed, shattered glass. But my body turned to stone, my mind clicking into something colder, something methodical. Each breath became a calculation. Each step backward felt like wading through molasses, but I forced myself to retreat, to breathe, to plan. Carson thought he had destroyed me. He thought the game was his alone. He had no idea what he had just created. As I turned from that door, my vision sharpened. I noticed details I'd overlooked before: a cufflink glinting on the carpet, one I hadn't bought him, the faint smell of cologne that wasn't his usual brand, the low vibration of a phone silenced too quickly. They were breadcrumbs, tiny fragments that promised more secrets waiting to be unearthed. I walked away with my face drained of color, my hands steady only because I forced them to be. In the mirror at the end of the hall, I caught a glimpse of myself, hollow eyes, clenched jaw. A woman unrecognizable from the one who had floated into marriage on dreams of devotion. The woman Carson married was gone. What remained was sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. And though I didn't know how, yet I whispered to my reflection, as if sealing a vow with myself, "He will regret underestimating me." I had always wondered how love stories began. Some start in laughter, others in a look across a crowded room. Mine began at a glittering charity gala in Manhattan, where chandeliers sprayed fractured light across crystal glasses and polished marble floors. At the time, it felt like fate. In hindsight, it was a carefully staged trap. Carson stood near the bar, a glass of whiskey in hand, posture so relaxed it looked rehearsed. His eyes scanned the room as though he owned it. When they landed on me, I felt as though I'd been chosen, plucked out from a sea of wealthy strangers. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere but here," he said, his smile sharp enough to cut. "Is it that obvious?" I replied, grateful for the attention. Most men at these events either ignored me or treated me like a bridge to my father's fortune. Carson seemed different. Only later did I realize how precisely he had studied me. He knew the perfect balance between charm and restraint, between showing interest and holding back just enough to seem mysterious. "Only to someone equally miserable," he said. His eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that made him appear approachable human. "I'm Carson," he added, extending his hand. "Selene," I said. I watched for a flicker of recognition, any sign he knew exactly who I was. His expression remained neutral, neither greedy nor impressed. How masterful that first performance had been. We spoke for hours, surrounded by glitter and music that blurred into background noise. He told me he had built his modest success through sheer determination. Grew up poor in Chicago, clawed his way out. He admired my ambition, asked about my dreams, in a way no man ever had before. I drank in his attention like a woman starved. By the end of the night, I was enchanted, and in truth, desperate. I wanted to believe someone could see me as more than my father's heir, more than a name on a ledger. 6 months later, he was on one knee at my favorite Italian restaurant, the ring hidden in a dessert. The diamond was modest by my family's standards, but Carson insisted he had bought it with his own money. "I don't want your father's influence on something this personal," he whispered. I cried. I thought it was love. My father approved of Carson instantly. That should have been my first warning. Jonathan Hart was not an easy man to impress. He dismissed my MBA with a pat on the head, calling the company a man's world. But Carson navigated conversations with him like a seasoned diplomat. Golf Politics quarterly reports subjects that drained me, but seemed to bond them like war comrades. "He's perfect for you, sweetheart," my father said. "Driven, respectful. He'll take good care of you and the family business." At the time, I believed him. I wanted to believe him. The wedding was everything a girl could dream of: cathedral vows, a plaza hotel reception, a honeymoon in Tuscany. Carson was the attentive groom, never leaving my side except when custom demanded it. Our wedding night was gentle, though passionless. He claimed nerves said he had never loved anyone as much as me. I mistook restraint for sincerity. We settled into the Brooks estate, the sprawling mansion that had become my mausoleum since my mother's death. Carson insisted it made financial sense. I was simply happy to imagine filling the empty rooms with love again. He took a position at Carson Industries. The cruel irony of his name felt like a cosmic joke I didn't yet understand. He shadowed my father, learning the ropes of a company my bloodline had built over decades. For a while, everything seemed idyllic. Flowers delivered without reason, thoughtful gestures whispered, "I love yous," before he left for work. To anyone watching, we were perfect. But even then, small cracks appeared. He never wanted friends over, always had excuses: too tired, too much work. His phone was perpetually face down, screen dark. At first, I told myself he valued privacy. When I asked about hosting dinner parties, he brushed it off with a smile, pressing a kiss to my forehead. "Work can wait. Nothing is more important than you." He rarely initiated intimacy. When he did, it was mechanical, almost dutiful. I blamed myself. Maybe I wasn't adventurous enough. Maybe I was too focused on business. Meanwhile, the business trips multiplied. Conferences, client meetings, industry events. He'd return glowing as though nourished by some secret energy source. I ignored the gnawing doubt, telling myself this was what marriage looked like. I cooked his favorite meals, supported his career, managed our social calendar. I loved him with the desperation of someone who had never been truly loved in return. But the signs were there. A forgotten receipt from a hotel in Boston when he claimed he was in D.C., a faint scent of cologne on a shirt that wasn't his usual brand, a cufflink on the bedroom dresser that wasn't part of any set I'd given him. They were puzzle pieces I refused to assemble, until the day I heard his voice through the bedroom door dripping with contempt. That day reframed everything. The flowers, the dinners, the whispered endearments, all of it part of the mask he wore. And I began to realize I wasn't just betrayed. I had been targeted. The morning after that hallway revelation, I woke before dawn, the house cloaked in silence. Carson slept beside me, his breathing steady, his arm draped across my waist, as if nothing had changed. To anyone else, it would have looked like intimacy. To me, it felt like a shackle. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the night before. His laughter, James's voice, the words about inheritance power of attorney, and my death spoken so casually. My mind sifted through memories like broken glass, each piece sharper than the last. The night he insisted we skip a friend's engagement dinner because he was too tired. The phone that always rang face down. The trips where he came back glowing, energized, yet distant. The way he'd once recoiled, almost imperceptibly, when I suggested we start a family. Each detail I'd brushed aside now returned like ghosts, demanding to be acknowledged. When Carson's alarm buzzed at 6:30, he stirred, kissed my shoulder, and muttered, "Morning, beautiful." His voice was warm, practiced. I whispered back a lie, "Morning." My tone was calm, almost sweet. Inside, my stomach turned. Over coffee, he asked about my presentation for the board later that day. He leaned across the counter, his eyes soft, his smile devastatingly convincing. "You'll blow them away. I'm proud of you." For the first time, I noticed the delay, half a second too long before he met my eyes. The mask was seamless, but I now knew to look for the cracks. He left for work, briefcase in hand, kissing me goodbye, with lips that had whispered my death sentence just hours before. The moment his car disappeared down the drive, I exhaled a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. My legs carried me to my home office almost on instinct. The lock clicked behind me, and I collapsed into the chair trembling. But trembling gave way to focus. If Carson was going to kill me, then I had to know everything. I started with the obvious. His social media, which I had never scrutinized closely. His Facebook was curated smiling photos of Uya's dinners with my father, the perfect husband. But there were gaps, weeks at a time, with no posts always aligned with his business trips. His Instagram told another story. Mostly us, yes, but certain pictures caught my attention. A restaurant in Boston I'd never been to. A hotel lobby I didn't recognize. Photos clearly taken by someone else from across a table from angles that suggested intimacy. And then I found him, James. James Callerman, 31 years old, personal trainer, divorced, no children. His profile was a shrine to his own physique, shirtless gym shots, motivational captions, smoothie bowls. But buried among them were snapshots that made my blood run cold. A watch I had seen on Carson's wrist. A dinner at a restaurant Carson swore was just a client meeting. Hotel room selfies that matched descriptions of Carson's conference accommodations. And then the post that gutted me, a photo of two men's hands, intertwined, matching rings glinting under low light. The caption, 3 years and counting. Love you, C. 3 years, the exact length of my marriage. Carson hadn't stumbled into an affair. He'd been with James before I ever entered the picture. My wedding vows had been nothing more than a contract signing for him, a performance he'd perfected long before. The screen blurred through my tears. For a moment, grief threatened to drown me, but grief hardened into something else, clarity. I began digging deeper. I rifled through drawers he claimed to keep organized in his office. In one folder labeled, innocuously, tax docs. I found slips of paper with numbers that didn't add up. Transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. Payments to a PI firm in Chicago. At first, I thought they might be legitimate business, but then I saw my own name on a report header subject Selene Hart. My blood chilled. He had investigated me, my routines, my habits, even a psychological profile describing me as susceptible to romantic manipulation, desperate for validation. He hadn't loved me. He had studied me. The realization nearly knocked me breathless. I was prey, and Carson had been the hunter all along. That night at dinner, I smiled across the table as Carson told me about supply chain challenges. I nodded, laughed at his jokes, pretended to be tired when he reached for my hand. The soup cooled in front of me, untouched, because now I wondered what he had slipped into it. He asked, "Everything okay? You're quiet tonight." "Just exhausted," I replied softly. My smile was convincing. My heart, however, was a drumbeat of rage. When he suggested going to bed early, I excused myself with the lie of unfinished work. I watched him walk upstairs, his footsteps measured confident, a man who thought he was in control. I stayed downstairs staring at my reflection in the darkened window. My face was pale, my eyes rimmed red, but beneath the exhaustion, I saw something new steal. Carson believed I was soft, trusting, easy to mold. He thought I would hand over my life, my fortune, my father's legacy, without a fight. He was wrong. The evidence was scattered, but I would gather it, piece by piece, secret by secret. And when I had enough, I wouldn't just survive him, I would destroy him. I whispered to the empty kitchen, "This ends on my terms." The lock on Carson's office was the sort you trusted because you'd never had reason not to. He'd asked me years ago not to go in too many paper piles, his system, he'd said with a lazy smile. And I'd always obliged out of a perverse respect for boundaries that now looked like naivete. That morning I told myself I was simply tidying, that the pretense would mask the theft I intended to commit of the truth. The office smelled faintly of cedar and cologne, a scent so familiar I almost welcomed it until I opened the top drawer of the filing cabinet and saw a folder labeled in Carson's neat, precise hand, PW Priscilla Brooks. My name, my maiden name, on a folder that had no business existing in his custody. My hands were steadier than I expected. I slid the folder out and sat on the edge of his chair, the leather cool under my thighs, and began to read. Photographs, dog-eared and glossy, slid out first images of me leaving the Carson Industries building 3 months before we ever spoke, a candid shot from the window of a cafe where I'd had lunch, a picture taken as I walked across a park on a rainy Tuesday. Each one had been taken from a distance, the kind of images that only someone looking at your life the way hunters study prey would take. Beneath the photos were pages in Carson's handwriting, clinical notes that read like a psychiatrist's assessment written by a man who had learned how people tick and then used that knowledge to his advantage. Subject displays abandonment issues after maternal death, seeks external validation through romantic attachment. Primary weakness, desperate for affection, highly susceptible to manipulation. The words were precise, heartless, and they made my skin crawl. I kept going. Receipts, bank transfer slips to shell accounts in Panama, documents from a private investigator with an address in Chicago. Copies illegal. I thought of a will that had been amended in ways I didn't remember consenting to, and then folded so neatly it could have been missed by a less deliberate eye, a life insurance policy. My breath stalled. 25 million dies. Carson Hart, sole beneficiary. Policy taken out 6 months after our wedding. I pressed the paper to my chest as if that might stave off the nausea. Numbers swam before my eyes. The policy referenced standard clauses, exceptions, and a beneficiary designation that could have easily been altered if someone with a law degree and access to private records wanted it so. It was a plan executed with the patience of a chess player, not the panic of a lover. He'd been calculating and patient-setting every piece on the board until the final checkmate could be played. I should have screamed. I should have called my father. Instead, I photographed everything with my phone hands, moving with a purpose that felt almost foreign, cataloging, digitizing, securing. Each snapshot felt like a small act of theft that belonged to a different, more legitimate narrative building a case. When I poked deeper into the drawer beneath folders marked clients and taxes, there was another envelope, its flap sealed with a strip of tape. I opened it with fingers that did not shake and found an even more chilling item. A printed email thread, parts of which should have been deleted, which discussed accelerating the timeline. Someone had typed, "House fire would be more believable given her habit of working late with candles," and signed it off with initials. The exact phrase I'd confessed to using, sometimes candles at the desk during late nights with sustainability reports, suddenly looked like a blueprint for murder. The office seemed to tilt. I glanced at the door as if expecting to find Carson standing in the frame, but it was empty. For the first time, the veneer of domestic certainty cracked into shards beneath my feet. There was a small noise, a creak from upstairs, and for a terrifying instant, I considered the possibility I'd been seen. My heart thudded against my ribs. Hands that had been steady trembled as I closed the folder and tucked the copies back into place, replacing receipts where I'd found them, smoothing the files down with a woman's practiced composure. I checked the floor for footprints, mentally erased the moment I'd been in here. My breath slowed. No one had come to the door. My near mistake would remain unremarked. I slipped the life insurance picture and the email printouts into my bag and moved to his computer. Carson had been reckless in one area. He used the same password across several accounts, a bad habit of people who inhabit many names. I had watched him log in enough times to catch the rhythm, his hand sliding the letters he favored. I typed what I had seen him use, James K. 2021. The screen blinked, then opened, as if conceding everything. His email was a thicket of lie and intent. Subject lines like Project P and transfer schedule hid the worst of it. Messages to a James K. Affectionate at first, then turning clinical P is completely trusting. Show no signs of suspicion. We may need to accelerate the timeline. The words were grotesquely mundane for such a monstrous intent. My eyes flicked to the deleted items folder. Carson had thought deletion meant oblivion. He understood neither technology nor the persistence of evidence when faced with a woman who had suddenly decided to be patient and relentless. I copied entire folders to a secure external drive, the kind my father's legal counsel had kept on hand for board meetings. The data copied in silence, like secrets being smuggled out of a vault. I labeled the drive with a code HAWK1. Then I closed the laptop, shut the office door, and walked down the hall with a calm I had not felt in years. On the way out, I paused at the framed photograph on his shelf, the wedding photo, where we stood in the plaza with champagne smiles. In the reflection of the glass, I saw not only our faces, but the dim outline of someone else in the background, a man half hidden by a potted fern, blurred but undeniably present. He looked like nothing more than a passerby. Yet the way the shutter had caught him, the angle where his coat collar rose against the light, suggested intention rather than accident. Had he been a watcher, a hired hand, or someone else entirely an early unnoticed ally? The small, off-kilter detail lodged in my mind like a splinter. I removed the frame, eased out the photograph, and turned it over. On the back, written in pen I didn't recognize, was a date and a street name. 1209 Bleecker, 7:30 p.m. A note, a breadcrumb. Someone else had been in places I never knew. I didn't know who that someone was yet, but the presence of that man added a new layer to the plan I began to sketch in the dark quiet of my car as I drove to the office to stand before my father and pretend to be his dutiful daughter. For the first time, my fury was not a roiling blind thing. It was precise. It had targets. It had names. It had the evidence to back it up. The first meeting with Diana Fletcher felt like walking onto a stage I'd never meant to audition for. She met me in a nondescript cafe off Park Avenue, a place where the clink of cups and low conversation offered cover. Diana was all efficiency, in a black coat, no lipstick, no small talk, hands that tapped a rhythm of purpose on the table. Her eyes were the kind that had seen too much and learned to store it like evidence. "Ms. Hart," she said, sliding into the seat across from me, with a folder already open. Up close, she was both smaller and more formidable than the photograph on her website suggested. "You sounded urgent on the phone. Start at the beginning." I told her what I had heard in the hallway, what I had found in Carson's office, and what the internet had confirmed: a man named James, a string of suspicious deaths, a life insurance policy, with my husband as beneficiary. I expected her to be shocked. Instead, she listened the way a surgeon listens for a pulse, attentive, clinical, already mapping what to cut and what to preserve. "You did well not to confront him," she said when I finished. "Most women make that mistake. They go loud and lose leverage. You need evidence, not hysteria." "What can you do?" I asked the question more practical than pleading. "Everything." "I can short of breaking the law," she replied. "Surveillance, financial tracing, background checks, undercover interviews. You'll need audio, video, bank records, anything that ties Carson to James and to the patterns from his previous marriages. And you'll need it without alerting him." We drew up lists in the margins of Diana's notebook. Hotel registries to subpoena through legal channels, credit card slips to cross-reference dates when Carson was in D.C., but posted in Boston. Diana's voice was a metronome that transformed my scattered panic into an inventory of tasks. Under the table, she slid me a business card and an offer. "You need a legal strategy, too. I work with a lawyer who doesn't flinch at complicated moral problems. Victoria Palmer. She's discreet and expensive. If you want to move beyond evidence and start planning with a legal backbone, she's the one." I felt my throat close around a laugh that was more like a sob. The plan forming in my chest was obscene in its precision: gather proof, protect assets, outmaneuver a man who had never been held accountable for anything. Diana's calm made it possible to imagine starting. Victoria Palmer was older, silver-haired, immaculately tailored, and theatrical in the way of people who had spent careers making the impossible look inevitable. She met me in her office, glass and leather, the kind of place where secrets sounded better because they echoed off oak. "Ms. Hart," she said the name, a scalpel. Diana tipped me off. "I've read the materials. This is elaborate." "It needs to be," I said. The confession felt easier when it had a legal mind at its side. I don't want a conviction for Carson's past killings. I want to make sure he never gets my father's company, never touches my inheritance, and never harms anyone else. Victoria considered me, then smiled in a way that suggested she understood the score without moralizing. "So you want to be legally dead while setting a legal trap. We can make the bureaucracy your weapon. Trust me when I say that systems built for order can be weaponized for delay." Her words were antiseptic and thrilling. "But you must understand the risk. Disappearing legally is an art in itself. Insurance companies, mortuary records, dental records, each has guardians. We'll need to anticipate every audit, every nosy coroner, every clerk who likes to do his job too well." I nodded. The idea of faking my death felt grotesque and yet like a feverish solution to a poisoning. I remembered the emails describing Housefire's specific phrases about accelerating timelines. If he'd been planning to make my death look accidental, then I would borrow his own cruelty to stop him. But Victoria's final sentence landed like a stone. If you choose this path, you must accept that your father will grieve you publicly, perhaps forever. You'll sacrifice a part of him for the sake of stopping a killer. I thought of my father's long face, the way the Brooks estate had become a mausoleum after my mother died. I thought of his shoulders broad and stoic, the man who had raised me on ledger books and hard edges. I swallowed. He will be told, I said in a voice that startled me with its certainty, but only when the trap is sprung and the mechanisms are in place. We rehearsed the logistics with a mania I would later recognize as necessary detachment. Victoria mapped out legal holdouts, trust structures, and layered policies that would entangle Carson in paperwork and delay. She planned for a $20 million policy to be the bait that would excite his greed while also buying us regulatory time. She arranged for dental records to be manipulated in a way that made identification probable for him, but not irrefutable under thorough investigation. It sounded monstrous spelled out on paper, but the words were tools, wrenches to jam the machine of his life. Practicalities were brutal. We needed a Jane Doe, someone whose unidentifiable remains could plausibly be matched to me through careful manipulation of dental and medical records. We needed to ensure that the explosion or fire would destroy certain forensic traces, while leaving others intact enough to convince the right people. We needed a safe house, a new identity, funds dispersed across international accounts, and a team that could move like ghosts. Diana explained the surveillance side we'd need to document Carson's financial behavior for months. Unexplained wire transfers offshore accounts, his contacts in Chicago, who supplied pest control equipment. The PI's voice was unsentimental. We can get him, but you must be patient. He's skilled at compartmentalization. Your job is to take away his compartments. That night alone in my car, outside my father's office, I let the enormity of it flood me. The plan was elegant and terrifying. Make him believe he had succeeded. Watch him dance into the net of legal delays. Victoria would lay like invisible wire, then shove him into the light of the law with evidence Diana's team would gather. But there was a moral wedge lodged in me. How much of myself would I have to burn to rebuild a world free of him? How much of my father's peace would I steal to stop a monster? I imagined my father's face at a funeral, the quietness of his hands when he folded a program, the finality of his voice when telling acquaintances that his daughter had died. I imagined him alone at night, asking himself what he had missed. That image ached sharper than any rage. Victoria took my hand as we signed initial retainer documents, her grip firm and dry. You know the alternative, she asked softly, almost kindly. He kills you. Or you go to the police with what you have and he vanishes into loopholes and charm. Your choice is to be loud and vulnerable, or to be invisible and strategic. I let her words settle. I had already made my decision in that hallway the night I heard my husband speak of my death like it were paperwork. The emotional woman who would have screamed and sought drama was dead. The Selene who sat now with Diana's notes and Victoria's legalese spread across a hotel table had the cold patience of someone who understood chess. One last note before we dispersed. Victoria raised a cautious eyebrow. There's one procedural weakness, she said, a minor inconsistency. If we don't handle it, the morgue's dental records cross-checks and a small city hospital camera that feeds to a regional archive. If that camera shows someone entering the house at a time that contradicts our timeline, it could unravel everything. We need to control that feed. Her mouth hardened at the edges when she said it, almost as if she suspected the existence of a lonely, vigilant neighbor who liked to keep old tapes. The flaw could be fixed, but fixing it would cost us time and secrecy we didn't entirely have. For the first time since the hallway, a sliver of doubt lodged in my chest. No plan is perfect. No deception goes without a loose wire somewhere. I let the worry sit there and hardened around it like armor. We'll handle it, I said. Whatever it takes. We left the hotel in different cars, moving into roles we had never auditioned for: client, conspirator, survivor. The machinery was in motion, now surveillance, legal labyrinths, false identities. I had crossed a line from the woman who sought love to a strategist who would use the law itself as a cage. The work would be ugly. The consequences might haunt me. But the alternative was a house where I lived my last days sleeping beside a man who had already decided to kill me. And so I stepped fully into what I had become: patient, precise, and finally dangerously resolved. The day I was meant to die began like any other Carson leaving, in his navy suit, pausing at the doorway to kiss my cheek. His lips lingered a second too long, his eyes soft with that devastating smile he had perfected. "Don't work too hard," he murmured. A husband's parting affection, or a murderer's final goodbye. I whispered back, "I'll see you tonight," and shut the door behind him. My hand stayed on the knob for a moment, listening to his footsteps fade across the gravel, the engine of his BMW growl to life, and the sound of it disappearing down the street. Then silence. Diana's team arrived 10 minutes later, unmarked van pulling up as though it belonged to the neighborhood. Men and women in plain clothes moved with the precision of stagehands preparing for a Broadway show. Inside, they set down black cases, steel boxes, and rolls of wiring. Victoria followed last, immaculate in a charcoal suit that didn't belong in the chaos of sawdust and propane tanks. She surveyed the room with her sharp eyes. "Let's begin," she said, her voice crisp, professional, almost reverent. They moved with military efficiency. 2 technicians carried a steel cylinder into the basement propane disguised with the labeling of a water heater maintenance company. Another unpacked a laptop, tapping rapidly as he adjusted timers and remote sensors. In the kitchen, someone laid out photos of the safe house where I'd be taken next, matching furniture down to the smallest detail so nothing in my story would unravel. It felt grotesque watching them build my death. The scent of gas filled the air as they tested valves, then flushed the room with fans to keep levels controlled until detonation. Upstairs, a woman in latex gloves unpacked a bundle wrapped in white cloth. A body, Jane Doe, someone who had died quietly of natural causes in a city morgue, now destined to be me. My stomach lurched. "We altered the dental records last night," Diana said softly, almost apologetic. "It'll pass casual scrutiny, enough for him to believe it." I stared at the body on my bed. Same height, same build. My hair color carefully dyed to match. My sweater pulled over her torso. The intimacy of it was unbearable. That body would be burned, mangled, declared mine. My father would see the ashes and believe his only daughter was gone. "Last chance," Victoria said, stepping closer. Her voice softened, losing its legal cadence. "Once we do this, Selene Hart ceases to exist. Forever." My throat tightened. I imagined my father stoic in a cathedral pew, clutching a folded program with my name on it. I imagined Carson at the pulpit, crocodile tears glistening, speaking about the wife who loved him more than life itself. My stomach twisted with grief and rage all at once. "I'm ready," I whispered. We rehearsed everything. Where I'd be when the gas ignited, how the neighbors would hear the explosion, what firefighters would find. Every detail had been accounted for, except life itself never obeys scripts. At 1:30, a delivery truck turned onto the street, a florist van driver slowing as though looking for an address. One of Diana's men stiffened. Not on the schedule. For a moment, panic prickled the air. But the van rolled past, stopping 3 houses down. A bouquet for a birthday, nothing more. Still, it proved how fragile the illusion was. One nosy neighbor, one random arrival, and everything could collapse. By 3, it was time. The technicians gave final nods, equipment humming like a heartbeat beneath the house. "We're set," Diana said. She glanced at me, her expression softening for the first time. "Let's get you out." I looked around the house one last time, the photographs of a marriage that had been a lie, the furniture chosen, with a man who had rehearsed my death in the same rooms the kitchen where I'd cooked his favorite meals, while he wrote emails about making my murder look accidental. On the staircase, I paused. A memory ambushed me, my mother decorating the banister with garlands one Christmas when I was 12. She'd laughed as she looped the ribbons, her hair falling into her eyes. That was the last Christmas before cancer hollowed her away. The house had become mausoleum once, and it would again, but this time it would be by my own design. I forced myself to walk out the door. The van swallowed me whole. From the back seat, I watched through tinted glass as the house receded, my home and prison shrinking into a dollhouse silhouette. I thought of Carson returning later, humming, pouring himself a drink, believing the universe had finally cleared his path. He would see the flames and think victory. At exactly 4:15, my phone rang. Victoria's voice came through steady as steel. "It's done." The explosion was visible from 3 blocks away. Fire department's already on scene. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then it hit me, in a wave relief, grief, triumph, terror. Any word from Carson, I asked. On his way, she said. Diana's people tapped his line. He sounds appropriately shocked. I closed my eyes. Images of fire seared behind my lids. Reporters' voices already filling the air with words like tragedy, accident, grieving husband. But amid the crackle of radio chatter from Diana's surveillance team, one note rose above the rest. A photograph had been delivered to the van's inbox time-stamped less than an hour earlier. The subject was blurred but unmistakable: Carson and James standing too close outside a storage unit, a lockbox between them. No one in Diana's team had taken it. Someone else was watching. Carson's performance in the days after my death was flawless. He stood outside the smoldering wreckage with neighbors at his side, pale and trembling. On television, his voice cracked at all the right moments. She was my life, my everything. I don't know how I'll go on without her. Tears streaked down his cheeks, perfectly timed, as reporters leaned closer with microphones. I watched from the safe house, the screen glowing in the dim light. To strangers, he was the portrait of a grieving widower. To me, every sob was counterfeit, every quiver rehearsed. Diana sat beside me, scribbling notes. He deserves an Oscar, she muttered, pressing pause. But grief wasn't Carson's only act. Behind closed doors, his mask slipped. Surveillance caught him on the phone with James less than 6 hours after the explosion. His voice, stripped of sorrow, was triumphant. It's done. The bitch is finally dead. $20 million from the new policy plus her inheritance. We're looking at close to $100 million, James. We'll never have to work again. He laughed, and that laugh, that same serpent's hiss I had heard in the hallway, reignited every ember of rage I carried. That was when we began pulling the strings. The first string was financial. Through a network of shell companies Victoria had arranged, I quietly bought up Carson's debts. Credit cards, the lease on his BMW, even the mortgage on the apartment he had suddenly rented, claiming the house was too full of painful memories. 3 days later, his cards froze. At dinner with James, a waiter returned his visa with a frown. "I'm sorry, sir. Declined." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat while Carson's jaw clenched. The next morning, his car disappeared from the curb. Repossessed. Surveillance cameras caught him swearing into his phone, then storming into the garage, demanding answers. The attendant shrugged. "Talk to your bank, sir." By the end of the week, he was stranded, humiliated, and forced to borrow James's beat-up sedan just to get around Manhattan. The second string was social. Subtle rumors surfaced in his professional circle. Former clients received anonymous tips to recheck their accounts. Audit requests trickled in. A former colleague whispered about regulatory violations. Within a week, contracts were canceled, colleagues stopped returning his calls, and his once pristine reputation in finance was tainted with suspicion. Diana handed me a thick packet of transcripts one night. "He's flailing. He thinks it's coincidence, but he's paranoid. He's starting to look over his shoulder." Good, I thought. Let him feel hunted. The third string was personal. Diana discovered James's weakness: gambling. High-stakes poker in Atlantic City. It didn't take much to arrange invitations to exclusive games paired with generous lines of credit. James took the bait. He lost spectacularly. $50,000 gone in a weekend. Within days, enforcers were circling. "You've got 1 week," one of them snarled, "captured on audio, or you're paying in blood." Panicked, James begged Carson for help. Surveillance caught the exchange. "50 grand, Carson barked. "Are you out of your mind?" "You said the money was coming soon," James shot back. "You promised we'd be rich. I thought I could take some risks." Carson's voice dropped cold and sharp. "Well, you thought wrong. Everything is tied up in probate. I can't just conjure 50,000 out of thin air." "You'd better find a way," James snapped. "Because if I go down, I'm not going alone." The tension between them grew with each passing day. Surveillance videos showed their arguments escalating. Carson pacing rooms, James clutching his head, their words knives thrown across hotel walls. And then came the messages. The first was a bouquet of lilies, Carson's old trick during our courtship, delivered to his hotel room. The card read, "From someone who remembers." Carson stared at the flowers for a long time, his hands shaking. He demanded answers from hotel staff, barked into his phone, then poured himself 2 tumblers of whiskey. He sat for hours just staring at the bouquet as though it might bloom into a ghost. The second arrived 3 days later. A photograph slipped under his door while he slept. Carson and James together at the storage unit, their faces caught in sharp relief by a telephoto lens. On the back in my handwriting, I see you now. He called James immediately, his voice high and jagged. Someone knows. Someone's watching us. That's impossible, James said, though his voice wavered. Who would be watching us? Why? Carson's answer was a long, shaky breath. I don't know, but they know about the trophies. There was a pause, then James's voice cut like glass. Trophies. What trophies, Carson? The silence was heavy, suffocating. Finally, Carson admitted, things I kept. From before, from the other wives. The sound that followed was James's sharp intake of breath. Other wives, how many, Carson? 3, he said, barely audible. The recording captured the moment the illusion cracked wide open. James's voice trembled hollow with disbelief. You killed 3 women, you god, you used me. Carson's voice turned pleading, desperate. It wasn't like that. They were stepping stones. Everything I did was for us. For us, James shouted raw. You murdered them for money, Carson. And now his voice broke. Now you're dragging me down with you. Diana paused the audio as we listened from the safe house. There she said, tapping the transcript. That's the first crack in their alliance. Fear, betrayal, the beginning of the end. But I barely heard her. I was still replaying Carson's voice in my head, the way he said stepping stones, the way he reduced 3 women's lives to paving stones for his fortune. And for the first time, I felt something close to satisfaction. The man who had hunted me, who had built an empire of lies on women's corpses, was unraveling. Piece by piece, I was pulling the mask off, and I wasn't finished yet. The second photograph hadn't just rattled Carson. It detonated something inside James. Diana's audio team captured every second of their argument that night, the air in their hotel room thick with betrayal. You told me it was just her, James hissed, his voice breaking. 1 woman, 1 mistake. Now I find out there were 3 others. Carson tried to soothe him, his tone syrupy, almost fatherly. It wasn't like that, James. They weren't accidents, no, but they were necessary. Each one brought us closer to the life we wanted. The life you wanted, James spat. You murdered them, and now you've dragged me into it. Do you have any idea what this means if someone else knows? Carson's reply was ice. It means we keep quiet, we wait for the payout, and then we vanish. Whoever's sending these messages, they're bluffing. They don't have proof. But for the first time, I heard doubt in his voice. That doubt became a fissure, and I was ready to drive a wedge straight through it. Diana had found her Martha Steinberg, the older sister of Rebecca, one of Carson's dead wives, a former detective turned private investigator. For years, Martha had been quietly building her own case against the man she knew as Robert Stone, the charming husband who lost her sister to a tragic drowning in her own pool. She agreed to meet me in a diner outside Philadelphia, far from prying eyes. She arrived in a beige trench coat, her hair cropped short, her eyes carrying the weight of battles fought and lost. She slid a worn folder across the table before she even ordered coffee. Rebecca was an Olympic-level swimmer, she said flatly. She didn't drown in 6 feet of water without help. I knew it then, and I know it now. But by the time I had enough evidence to make noise, he was gone, vanished. And the cops, they don't like cases that make them look like fools. I opened the folder. Inside were grainy photographs of Carson, different hair, different name, standing by Rebecca, at charity events by her pool, even caught on security footage in sunglasses and a smirk. Bank records showing money moved just days after Rebecca's death. Witness statements from neighbors who saw them arguing, Rebecca shouting that she didn't feel safe. He left with a new name and a clean slate, Martha continued, until your face popped up on the news, until I saw him again. I don't know who you are, lady, but you're not dead. Her eyes locked on mine, sharp, unforgiving. You're right, I whispered. I'm not yet. But he thinks I am, and I need him to keep thinking that until I can end this. Martha leaned back, a slow smile tugging at her lips for the first time. Then maybe finally we're on the same side. Meanwhile, Victoria worked her own brand of magic. She had begun the legal siege, a campaign of bureaucratic sabotage, so subtle, it looked like coincidence. Insurance companies demanded more documentation. Probate courts requested corrections. Financial institutions placed holds for compliance reviews. Every delay was a tripwire disguised as paperwork. Carson, once suave and unshakable, was unraveling. Surveillance caught him slamming a phone against the wall of his hotel room, cursing at an insurance agent. What the hell do you mean another 90 days? His frustration was fuel. The more desperate he grew, the sloppier he became. To tighten the noose, Diana's team traced the storage unit Carson had mentioned. They cracked it open under cover of night, their cameras flashing in the dark. The footage they brought back made my stomach twist. Inside were boxes of women's belongings, a gold bracelet I'd once seen in a photograph of Angela Morrison, another of his widowed wives, a silk scarf embroidered with the initials L.H. Lisa Hartford, pearls that matched the set Martha had described her grandmother giving Rebecca, and among them pieces of me. A necklace I thought I'd lost during our honeymoon in Tuscany. A journal I'd abandoned months earlier, its pages still carrying my handwriting. Even a photo from our wedding day, my smile bright. His hand at my waist, defaced by a deep crease through the middle. He had been keeping trophies, not just of them, of me. I pressed the images to my chest that night, shaking every nerve burning with revulsion. But beneath the horror, there was also clarity. These weren't just mementos, they were evidence. Enough to paint him not as a grieving husband, but as a predator who had stalked and collected his victims like game. That week I left my first true mark. A registered letter arrived at Carson's hotel. Inside was a court order. All assets connected to my estate were frozen pending investigation. Accompanying the order was an anonymous tip sent to federal authorities, complete with photographs from the storage unit financial records from his accounts and snippets of recorded calls between him and James. He didn't know it yet, but the law was finally breathing down his neck. From the safe house, I watched him pace his hotel room like a caged animal. He screamed into his phone at James, at lawyers, at insurance adjusters. His face, once smooth and controlled, was cracked with rage. And then the final blow of the week, a DVD slipped under his door. When he pressed play, he found himself staring at footage from the day of my death. The camera caught him leaving the house that morning, kissing me goodbye, walking to his car with a swagger that reeked of certainty. But the footage didn't end there. It showed Diana's team setting the stage, the gas tanks, the careful placement of the Jane Doe. And then, as the lens panned across the empty bedroom, one final image appeared, scrawled across the mirror in red lipstick in my handwriting. "Did you really think you could kill me and get away with it?" The microphone picked up his scream, a sound ripped, not from grief, not from anger, but from fear. For the first time since I had met him, Carson Hart looked truly hunted, and it was only the beginning. The day Carson's empire collapsed began with a knock on his hotel door. He answered in yesterday's suit tie, loosened eyes bloodshot from another sleepless night. What greeted him wasn't room service or James bringing coffee. It was the FBI. "Carson Hart," the lead agent asked, voice firm but calm. Carson blinked, then forced the mask back on that polite smile he'd practiced his entire life. "Yes, is there a problem?" The problem was standing in front of him, a half-dozen agents with a warrant. They pushed past seizing laptops, files, even the Rolex on his wrist. He sputtered objections. "This is outrageous. My wife just died, but the cameras were already rolling." Reporters, tipped off by a carefully timed call, crowded the curb outside. I watched from a surveillance van parked across the street. Diana handed me headphones so I could hear every word. "Mr. Hart," the agent said as he read from a sheet, "you are under arrest for the murders of Lisa Hartford, Rebecca Steinberg, Angela Morrison, and Selene Hart." For a moment, Carson froze. His lips parted, his pupils contracted, as if his mind had failed to compute the last name. Selene Hart. My name. Alive in a list of the dead. Then he recovered, shaking his head with a theatrical despair. "Selene died in an accident. You can't. This is insane." But the world had already seen the trophies. The storage unit, the pearls, the bracelet, the photographs. There was no covering it now. They led him out in handcuffs, and the cameras devoured him, once the charming husband, now a serial predator. His photograph flooded news outlets by evening, his smirk side by side with headlines calling him the marriage killer. The trial was a circus. For 3 months, I sat in the gallery, disguised dark glasses, a wig, a new name on the attendance list, while Carson squirmed under the weight of evidence. The prosecution painted him with surgical precision. A man who reinvented himself with each new target, who studied wealthy women like case files, who murdered them when their usefulness expired. The jurors saw the emails, heard the recordings. One played in full Carson's voice, dripping with contempt. 3 years of playing house with a naive little bitch. $23 million. That's all she was worth. Some jurors flinched. Others hardened their jaws. James testified, too. He cracked within days of interrogation, spilling everything. He described Carson's plans in detail, the poisoning, the staged accidents, the fantasies of disappearing with stolen millions. His voice trembled on the stand, but his words were steady. He didn't love them. He didn't love me. We were just pieces on his board. Then came Martha Steinberg. She described her sister Rebecca, the joy she carried, the fear that shadowed her final weeks, the fight she had with Carson days before she drowned. Martha's voice was a weapon sharpened by years of grief. Her testimony pierced through every excuse the defense tried to build. Carson's lawyers fought viciously. They argued coincidence, financial stress, overzealous investigators. They painted him as a victim of circumstance, a man broken by grief. At one point, they claimed his relationship with James was proof of emotional instability rather than cold calculation. But the evidence was too much. The jury had heard his own laughter as he plotted my murder. They had seen the pattern across 3 states, 3 women, 3 corpses. They had seen my belongings items he couldn't explain away. When the verdict was read, the courtroom felt like a held breath finally released. On the charge of first-degree murder, guilty. On the charge of fraud, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy, guilty. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Carson's legs buckled. He gripped the defense table for balance, his charm shattered, his composure gone. The judge's eyes were cold as she spoke. "Mr. Hart, you have shown no remorse. You are a predator who preys on love and trust. You will spend the rest of your life in prison without the possibility of parole." And then they let him speak. He rose, chains rattling, and turned to the jury with eyes that still tried to seduce. "I loved her," he said, voice trembling with false sincerity. "I love Selene more than life itself. Everything I did was because of that love. Maybe I was greedy, maybe I lost my way, but don't tell me it wasn't real. I felt bile rise in my throat. Love." The same man who had planned my murder with the efficiency of an accountant dared to speak of love. In the gallery, I clenched my fists so tightly my nails drew blood. It took every ounce of restraint not to stand and shout, "You loved no one but yourself." The judge was unmoved. "Save your performance for the mirror, Mr. Hart. Sentencing stands." The gavel struck final and merciless. Later that night, in the safety of the Hamptons estate Victoria had secured, I removed the wig and glasses and stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror wasn't the naive bride who once swooned at a gala. She was sharper now, colder forged in betrayal. But one chapter had ended. Carson was caged. I poured a glass of wine, lifted it toward the window, and whispered into the night. "You thought I was prey, but I was the hunter all along." For the first time in months, I almost believed myself. The trial was over, but the story wasn't finished. Not for me, not for my father, not for the ghosts of the women Carson had already taken. Victoria arranged our reunion quietly far from the cameras. My father thought he was being brought to sign documents about the estate still raw from what he believed was my death. When I stepped into the room, his face collapsed. For a moment, he just stared, his mouth working, but no sound emerging. His hands trembling, as if he feared I was a hallucination. "Dad," I whispered. He staggered forward and pulled me into his arms, sobbing into my shoulder. I hadn't heard my father cry since my mother's funeral. "I thought you—" His voice broke. "I buried you, Selene." I held him tighter. "I know. I'm so sorry. I had to. If I hadn't, he would have killed me." He pulled back just enough to search my face, and I saw both grief and pride in his eyes. "I should have protected you," he said. "No," I told him firmly. "You raised me to be strong enough to protect myself. That's what saved me." For hours we sat together, unraveling months of deception, years of pain. I confessed everything, how Carson had hunted me, how I'd faked my death, how I'd chosen silence over confrontation. My father listened silent, his jaw set. At last he said, "You're your mother's daughter." She would have been proud and terrified. In the months that followed, I reclaimed my life, though it no longer looked like the one I'd lost. Carson Industries, now stripped of his poisonous shadow, became my battleground and my redemption. I pushed through the sustainability initiative I'd once only dreamed of. The company transformed not just in profit, but in purpose. For the first time, I didn't feel like my father's heir. I felt like my own leader. But there was another mission that consumed me more deeply: the foundation. The Selene Hart Foundation, dedicated to women trapped in the kind of gilded cages I'd nearly died in. We offered legal aid, financial protection, safe houses. We hunted predators who preyed on love. Each time we saved someone, I thought of Lisa, Rebecca, Angela, women who hadn't had the chance I did. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with prison markings, Carson's handwriting unmistakable on the front. My hands shook as I slid it open. "Selene," it began, "I know you're alive. I know you orchestrated everything. And I admit I underestimated you. I never thought you could be so ruthless, so calculating. You learned well from me, but I also know the woman I married is still inside you, the one who loved me, the one who believed in me. I'm asking for mercy. Come visit me. Let me explain. I still love you. Forever, Carson. I read it 3 times, fury building with each line. Even caged, stripped of his freedom, he was still trying to twist the narrative, still trying to make me his creation. I wrote 1 sentence in reply: I was never yours, and you were never mine. I never heard from him again. Years have passed. Carson will die behind bars remembered, not as a husband or a businessman, but as a predator. I rebuilt the company, expanded the foundation, even wrote a memoir, not for fame, but for the women who needed to see themselves in my story, and no escape was possible. And somehow, against all odds, I began to heal. His name is Marcus Webb, a forensic psychologist who profiles predators like Carson. We met at a conference where I spoke about financial abuse in marriages. He knew my story before I told him. Instead of pity, he offered understanding. He joked when I admitted I'd run a background check on him. I would have been disappointed if you hadn't, he said with a grin. Marcus doesn't try to erase my scars. He accepts them, proves himself, not with pretty words, but with consistency. With him, I learned to breathe again, to trust in measured doses, to love without surrendering myself. Sometimes at night, I stand on my terrace overlooking the city and think about the woman I used to be, the naive bride who believed in forever, the trusting wife who slept beside a predator. She's gone, killed as surely as if Carson had succeeded. What remains is someone sharper, harder, but also stronger, a woman who turned pain into purpose, who chose to hunt instead of be hunted. Carson thought he had written the ending of my story, but in truth, his greatest mistake was creating the woman who would finish it. I am Selene Hart, survivor. Hunter. He thought I was prey. He thought I would die quietly. Instead, I rose from the ashes he tried to bury me in. And I will never be anyone's victim again.